Aanan, hi, good to have you with us. How have you been?
Been great. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited, to be doing the session with you, right? This is a session which has long been in the making. I'm excited about it, right? Because the way India has converged after 2020, and a 2022 environment, right? I think is absolutely spectacular, phenomenal at very many levels, right? We've become an information-first economy, which essentially means that the level of awareness is just so much more higher. Right, today people have become, and I think as an after effect of COVID, I think people have realized that we're extremely fragile, right? We cannot be in denial anymore, and we need to start taking and prioritizing our health just so much more importantly, right? And with a deep focus. And I think in an environment like that, I think what you're doing at Wellverse becomes just so much more important, right? We're going to talk about all of that in the process and through the course of the conversation, but I'd love you to introduce yourself as a starting point, and we dive into the conversation from there on.
Great. Once again, thanks for having me. I am the founder and CEO of Wellverse. Wellverse is an aggregator for wellness brands where we, identify wellness brands early in their life cycle. We help them scale across e-commerce channels and then eventually end up acquiring a few of those brands to scale them further. So essentially what we like to call ourselves, we are a highly vertically integrated aggregator player where we take over everything from supply chain to story building to getting to the right consumers and building repeat rates.
Interesting, very interesting, Manan. Manan, you're left hand, right? Something that you kind of alluded to. I'd love to dive a little deeper in that, right? Now, I'd love to understand some of these brands very early on their journey, right? You're kind of hand-holding them, taking them certain market fit, right? And then, you also have an element where you could potentially acquire these brands, right? So it's a very interesting mix of, two very different, business models, right? But, here you have a very interesting play, right? Tell us a little more about that, the construct, and where have you gotten in your journey? I'd love to understand that.
So, to start from the very beginning, what we feel is that consumer brands are like religions, right? So people like to achieve the same goals, but with different set of ideologies. And that is what you will see in the consumer brand space. The winner take all approach never works, right? You'll always have, a competing brand taking market share and all that stuff, right? So consumer brands are built on ideologies. And when we started Wellversed, we truly realized that, if we have to cater to a large audience, we have to build several number of brands, right? And brand building itself is a very risky proposition, right? Every brand requires a lot of energy to be poured in, and a lot of capital goes into building that, identifying the product market fit, product channel fit, brand channel fit, and stuff like that, right? So what we have essentially done is we have systematized the process of brand building, consumer brand building, and we have kept ourselves vertically confined so that the information that we have on consumers is very high. The information that we have on point of sales is very high. The information that we have on point of brand building is very, very high, right? So it's a vertically integrated model. Now, the way we like to think of this is a student going through primary school, secondary school, and then college, and then a PhD program probably, right? So a student, when they enter the education system, they cannot be taught what is taught at a PhD level, right? So they have to go through primary school, their basics have to be fixed, then they go to secondary school. So this is something that we do for brands, right? So the first and we do it in a metric driven fashion, right? So when we onboard a brand into the Wellverse accelerator, which is the first phase of what we do at Wellverse, the brands are doing a monthly revenue of around 3 to 4 lakhs per month, and founders are very confused about how to position their products. They have a very wide SKU offering. Sure. So they are getting 3 to 4 lakhs per month revenue from, let's say, 30 SKUs, which is not a great way to build a brand, right? So their journey from 30 to 3 lakhs per month to 40 lakhs per month kind of a revenue is taken care by the Wellverse accelerator, where we train the founder, we impart them a lot of knowledge. We help them build metric-based P&Ls, which are, so they can enter the second phase of brand building, where they can pour more capital on the brand. At this phase, either we'll help the brand raise more funds through our network, or we'll essentially end up acquiring the brand, right? And then this is the second phase of brand building, which we term as the secondary school for brands, where we will completely revamp the brand positioning, brand story, and how the product looks and things like that. So typically, once the brand has passed the first stage, we are left with 3 to 4 SKUs, and we completely work on the brand story and then scale it further. And then rest is mostly, the playbook has been defined very well by incumbent players like Unilever, Nestle, Mondelez, and those are the playbooks that we follow. We have a lot of strategy guidance. We have hands-on people from these companies who are part of Wellverse now.
Very interesting. Anand, I want to understand this, right? Now, typically a company, which is in the B2C space and in the healthcare space, right? Doing 3-4 lakhs of a top line is not necessarily a very, very interesting and an exciting number, right? I think to an extent, one will be very doubtful of even the quality, for example, of the product, right? Not many are going to qualify in that standpoint, right? So there are two extremes, right? When you talk about specialized products, right? Where, for example, you're talking about whey's, for example, you're talking about nutraceuticals and all that. I mean, that's one extreme of it, right? Where you need a specialized player to come in and do the manufacturing, so on and so forth, right? And then the other extreme is where you're possibly doing a certain variety of nuts and, which is like a very classic, almost not necessarily very heavily processed, right? That extreme, right? Now, a 3 lakh, 5 lakh top line, a monthly top line, right? On an extreme which is not necessarily heavily processed, right? Is a good reflection, right? From a sales standpoint, right?
Right. So see,
you start looking at, it's a complicated one, right? What's the selection process like, right? Because, and like I said, right, my concern is that, quality possibly might not necessarily be the sharpest, right?
Right.
To be part of your, say, funnel, what are the kind of checks and balances that you look at?
I think you very rightly mentioned that early stage brands may have quality issues. And we have evolved a playbook which is backed by quality assurance processes. Since when we started the company in 2018, we got very deep into manufacturing. One of our co-founders, Aditya Seth, he's dedicated to building the supply chain of our own products when we started building products. So from a legacy standpoint, our quality assurance processes are kind of modeled on what Nestle does or what Unilever does, because it's from their playbook that we have adopted the quality assurance processes, right? Mm-hmm. So when we decided to onboard a brand into the Wellverse accelerator, it goes through certain checkpoints. First, in terms of strategic positioning, that whether it's contributing to human wellness or not, right? So when all those strategic check marks are met, then it goes to product quality assurance check mark list, right? Mm-hmm. Now we see two kind of players out there, right? So one kind of players are legacy manufacturers trying to manufacture something new. They have great expertise over manufacturing, but cannot sell brands or products digitally, right? Mm-hmm. So these are the kind of brands which quickly meet the quality assurance requirements because they already have everything, ISO, FSSAI, all that in place, right? So there's no issue with these kind of players. But then there's second kind of players who strategically fit very well with the vision. The founders are, extremely passionate about bringing a change in the behavior people consume products, because wellness is slightly about behavior change in that sense, right? But these players may not have a lot of quality assurance, or they are usually contract manufacturing their products and stuff like that. So our quality assurance team actually interfaces with their contract manufacturers, and we go through their compliance and what they're doing and what they're not doing. And what happens is that the way our model works is, once a brand is onboarded into the Wellverse accelerator, by the way, which only has a 30% selection rate, right? So out of 100 brands profiled, only 30 will be eligible for the accelerator in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. We completely take over their logistics supply chain also. So the products are routed to our supply chain. Some of the products come to our warehouses where they are randomly QA'd, and all those processes are in place. So that's how we go about it.
Interesting. Anand, very interesting. The kind of process that you've built, right, are very interesting, right? Because I think that level of assurance is very, very important in a consumer environment today, right? Now, what I want to understand is essentially the cost level construct, right? Now, when you're doing what you're doing, right? I mean, a lot of these brands are essentially also existing on other marketplaces, right? Right. So Wellverse is something which is still sort of kind of picking up, right? When you're looking at, say, the Amazons and the Flipkarts of the world, Nike, they're like the bigger boys which are out there, right? They already have a lot of traffic, right? How, for example, when you're doing all of this layering, when you're doing this kind of hand-holding in the process and stuff like that, right? What's the kind of impact that's there on the pricing, right? I mean, are you able able to offer better deals, or are you almost matching what's available at other platforms, right? Because at the end of the day, Indian consumer, right, is extremely cost conscious, right? They flip through all of those platforms, they look at best deals, and they kind of pick it up from there, right? The bigger boys also have a certain assurance in the process, right? How do you see that, as a play, right? Because engagement to me in e-commerce is a function of pricing, right? What's your sense of it? How do you see that?
So, fundamentally, the way we think about consumer brand building, when you have tangible products, you cannot simultaneously control, what you're trying to build and the channel you want to sell it. So you cannot impose your will on the consumer that you will buy this product from only this channel, right? So a consumer brand has to be built on repeat rates, and the customer should have the flexibility to buy the product from anywhere, right? So that's the holy grail of brand building. So what our model does is we don't solely rely on scaling this brand via the Wellverse website. In fact, Wellverse website would contribute only 20% to your total sales. When we say acceleration, we mean we become their primary digital distributors across Amazon, Flipkart, Nykaa, Myntra, the top 20 e-commerce channels in India, right? So that is how the model works, because just listing your product on Amazon or Flipkart is not going to make it sell, right?
Sure.
It has to go through certain checkpoints. You have to have logistic warehousing optimization, ad operation optimization, listing operations, all that needs to be done. And these early stage players cannot afford to build teams. It'll cost them a lot more than what they charge them for this shared service.
Very interesting. And what I want to understand, right, and is that when I look at the website, right, I mean there are some amazing brands that are listed, right? So while of course you have some of these selected nominal sales, right? For example, Alpino I see listed on your website, right? Now your model, like you said, right, is a combination of a specialized e-commerce play. And also a Firatio-like model in many ways, right? Where you would eventually want to build a certain element of ownership in the assets that are listed on your platform, right? How do you see that, right? Because some of these brands, like I said, are a little ahead in their journey, right? From say an investor standpoint or an acquisition standpoint, they're going to qualify for some of the bigger boys in the game, right? Now the aspiration continues to be the same, or this is something which is when it comes to e-commerce, you have to kind of balance it with making all the products available, right? What's the logic and thesis there?
Right. So fundamentally what's happening across the world is that people are getting more attuned towards their personalized style of wellness, right? So there are a lot of different wellness needs which didn't even exist, let's say 5-6 years ago, right? So the landscape is evolving very, very fast. So on the one hand, to get scale, the aspiration might be to acquire larger brands and add GMV and bottom line, right?
Sure.
But the fundamental aim of Wellverse is to be able to capture niches as they are opening up, right? And that cannot be done by a central team or an incumbent universe style model. We have to have people who are on the ground, who are facing those challenges themselves, coming up with products and solving those problems. And these are the kind of people that we want to capture. So from a strategic 5-year, 10-year point of view, you want to have brands that will actually totally dominate those niches, right? And from legacy perspective of when we were building the model, we might see brands like Alpino and these brands, but the aim is more geared towards addressing the newer needs of the modern population.
Interesting. And how difficult is it to make to kind of maintain balance between the two, right? Because like you said, and I can only imagine how difficult it is, right, to kind of maintain that balance, right? How easy or difficult is that?
So it is very difficult. So the way we
between your e-commerce strategy and you're wanting to say own a brand, right? How tempting is that?
It's very tempting, in fact. So we think of it from we have dedicated bandwidths for brands that are making a change or will be the change makers in the coming years, and brands which will be stable, bottom line positive business. Wellverse, and there's this specific percentage dedicated to each of those. And
Sure.
when we think about acquisitions, when we want to acquire these kind of brands, let's say we are in the process of providing a very large A2 ghee brand which we want to add to our team, not just from the product portfolio perspective, but also from acquiring the team who has certain set of expertise that we want within our team, right?
Sure.
So those are strategic acquisitions, and those add team strength. Top line is obviously there, but bottom line is there. Yeah.
Very interesting. Now, Aanan, when we look at the entire spectrum of e-commerce, right, and especially when we look at D2C, right, essentially what we've realized is that for a brand to scale in a market like India, cannot be 100% digital strategy, right? Eventually, a lot of these brands will have to have a physical element, right? And I think that's a common narrative across pretty much all the brands, right? Who've gotten to a 20, 25, 30 crore top line, right? They're kind of itching to get into a physical environment, right? Because the sales volumes could possibly almost quadruple in less than a year, right? India is still a very touch and feel market, especially tier 2 and downwards, right? What's your sense of it, right? I mean, you are right now, calibrated to a very digital first environment, right? You're building all of these brands in a very digital first way. What's your sense of it? I mean, do you see, all of these brands, Wellversed, for example, the e-commerce play, having some sort of a physical existence or brands within your portfolio, right? Being on shelf across, say, some of the other brands which are very, very strong, relevant, have a strong presence in a physical environment, right? What's your modern retail possibly in some cases, right? Or OTC, right? Do you see some of that happening with the brands that you own or your e-commerce strategy?
Right. So, typically when we have a discussion around D2C brands, I typically like to tell people that there's nothing known as D2C brand, right? So D2C is a channel. A brand is something that you're building in the mind of the consumer, and it should be present across all the channels, right? So D2C is always going to be one of the channels that you have, and there is no other way than going omni-channel to build a brand. So it might be true for very, very specific kind of experiences, and when you are doing very, very specific niche kind of products, but typically for 95-96% of the brands, omni-channel is the way to go. Mm-hmm. But coming back to how and when a product needs to be taken offline or to other channels, we again have to come back to that ideology of the schooling system, right? So brand passes through certain stages. So if a single SKU has reached, let's say, 60-70 lakhs per month kind of sales with lifetime repeat rates of 65%, probably you can do a very detailed analysis of geographies that the product is selling in and selectively or surgically go offline in those geographies. Right? So offline is a proven model that it's all about how smartly you play it out, how patiently you play it out, because people have this idea, you just put all the products on offline store and you start selling, right? So it's a combination of being data backed and being patient that you take your products offline. And I think the great thing about how we are building Wellverse is that Jubilant Foodworks is one of our largest investors, and they are building a very dedicated offline channel specifically for these kind of brands. They are invested in other such companies, other consumer brand companies, and this is going to give us a huge I would say advantage in certain terms, because as and when our SKUs become ready for offline distribution, they can straight away be plugged into that pipe.
Very interesting. Aanan, when you think of India, right, there's another very, very big challenge, right? And that challenge is that, we have many, many cultures, right? They're a very diverse market, heterogeneous market, right? Now, typically in an environment like that, it's very difficult to, scale businesses beyond a certain point, right? Because, every region has its own thesis around certain products, for example, right? I mean, North is going to have a certain thesis, West is going to have a certain thesis, right? That's number one, right? Number two is, that's actually part one of the problem, right? The other part of the problem is that there are a lot of local brands, right, which are doing exceptionally well. Of course, there is a certain audience which is educated and which is open to consuming newer brands, right? Has more disposable income, so they will go online and kind of continue to engage with the newer brands, right? That are available on Wellverse or some other platforms, right? But there are many of these regional brands, right, that are there, and a very large percentage of people tend to stick to that environment, right? And these are brands that do not necessarily have a preference to come online. They're extremely comfortable within the regions that they're catering to, and the allegiance and the affection and the love that and the relationship that they have with the consumers there within those regions, right? How do you see that, right? Because that's something which across many forums and many quarters is being discussed as one of the very critical problems, right? That many of the direct-to-consumer, and when I say direct-to-consumer, I essentially mean the modern-day, FMCG companies that are getting built, right? They're facing a lot of that. What's your sense of it? How do you see that? Is there a shift that you see, or you believe that's something which will have to have a different strategy to be dealt with?
So I think specifically when it comes to wellness, India is a very early stage market, and given the purchasing power parity in India, the wellness niches are still not well developed. They are not deep enough for brands to become large, right? So as I mentioned earlier, our aim is to capture that niche and then keep on growing that brand at the rate at which that niche is growing, right? So be on top of that niche. So that is one thing. But I think coming back to your question, what needs to be realized for every consumer brand is that there is going to be a natural ceiling to a brand. Now, whether that's 100 CR per year, that's 500 CR per year, or 1200 CR per year, right? So Unilever has around 8 brands in India that are around 1200 CR per year kind of brand, 1200 CR per year kind of brand. Right? So now it all boils down to acquiring new consumers versus impacting your repeat rate. So every brand will aspire to break this ceiling or the plateau that it is at, but I think the balance has to be maintained between you acquiring new consumers and gauging how it's impacting your repeat rate, right? So if your lifetime repeat rate metric is 60%, that your entire sales for the month, 60% of it has to come from repeat users, right? So that metric needs to be maintained and be defined and be intelligently gauged. So some player will say, okay, we'll do some higher degree of experimentation in new geographies. Our repeat rates will go down for a while, but we are sure after tinkering with the product and fine-tuning it to the new geography, we will get our repeat rates back to there. So I think it has to be an intelligent mix of those two metrics there.
Very interesting. Aaron, you have Yuvraj Singh as your brand ambassador, right? I think everybody loves UP, right? We cannot deny it, right? But in a way, you also opened up this entire market to many other celebrities, right? Right. What's the thesis and thought process there? That's very clearly a very strategic move, right? And that's largely a lot of these celebs bring in a certain familiarity. They become, they kind of exude a certain amount of trust, right? And an affinity that people have, right? And we love our celebs, be it cricketers, be it movie stars, right? You have a very clearly cut out strategy. Do you want to talk about that? I think it'd be interesting to know some of that.
So, the strategy of whether it's, celebrities or influencers, we approach this problem very differently, right? So what we have understood as a team is that, to build long-term brands patiently with stable bottom line, you first need to identify the right set of audience, right? So typically the mistake that brands make in scaling is that they will scale their digital performance spends or ad spends a lot and end up capturing consumers and end up having learning of users which are never going to repeat purchase, right? So our aim with celebrity is not just to slap a picture on the product or do advertising with them or get more people in the funnel, right? So our aim is first to build the community around these influencers or these celebrities. So typically, as we talked about earlier, when a brand enters the second phase of its life cycle, where we start doing the brand building, dedicatedly for that brand, what we do is we club them with influencers, and we scale down performance marketing spends to, let's say, of ROS more than 4 or 5 typically, right? So what we allow influencers to do is we allow them to capture the right audience who's purchasing the products and repeat purchasing the products, and we let that learning happen within the digital pixels and within the digital systems, right? And then we scale performance spends to similar kind of audiences, right? So celebrity for us is a way to identify the repeat audience and then scaling marketing spends post that. So it's not the other way around. So a very different approach there. Yeah. And typically the way we are trying to build brands is we are trying to couple every owned brand that we have with one celebrity face who lives the ethos, right? So let's say we are working on a brand called UV Fit, which is a dedicated brand for Yuvraj Singh, right? So he's personally lactose intolerant, and so the entire brand is centered on that ideology and things like that. So every celebrity has to be clubbed with a brand where they live and breathe the ethos, and this has been systematically proven in the last 10 years, in the US and Europe. Yeah.
Very interesting. And Indian consumer is at least the urban consumer, right, is kind of spoiled for choice, right? Today there are many brands that are coming up, right? And I think the temptation of choosing a newer brand every single time, I think it's just very high. I think that's not necessarily true for, say, the wellness category, right, or the healthcare category, or borderline healthcare category, if I can put it that way, right? But in general, when you're talking about, say, peanut butters, when you're talking about coffee mixes, those, right? People want to try newer things, right? What's your sense of that, right? Because this is possibly one of the most difficult challenges out there. Is the fleeting customer, right? The fact of the matter is that there is a lot of content which is kind of influencing the consumer behavior, right? Brands don't necessarily have the bandwidth to adjust to these changing, evolving demands very quickly, right? They're calibrated to be producing at a certain level, right? Because quality assurance and a bunch of other things that kind of become very important, right? India is starting to see some homogeneity coming in, right? In our demands and preferences, right? And that's largely because of the content consumption, right? It's kind of galvanized the market in a certain format, right? What's your sense of it? I mean, how do you look at that as a challenge which is seemingly small right now, but over a period of time could become this massive challenge for everybody who works, has this portfolio of brands, because this demand is ever shifting, right? You cannot necessarily have a very predictable environment with some of this, right? What's your thought process on that?
So I think you very rightly pointed out that there are a lot of options out there, but what happens, there are different phases within consumer preferences and within the market, right? So let's say there are a lot of brands working on similar products. They get their product manufactured by the same contract manufacturer and all that stuff, right? So eventually the winning brand will have to have certain degree of uniqueness within the supply chain also, whether that's they are able to command a better pricing, they are able to create a unique product. So let's say if we talk about beer brands, it's not a rocket science. Beer brewing is not rocket science, but every brand has able to crack a certain supply chain where they are able to produce a specific taste at a specific price, right? So when that kind of uniqueness of the product matches the price point, that is where the brand starts standing out. And when we say we are a vertically integrated aggregator player, this is exactly because we anticipate that after one scale, the product uniqueness has to be there, and you have to bring down the pricing at that uniqueness, right? So I think without supply chain innovation, it's not going to be possible. And frequently contract manufacturing is cited for larger players, right? That Coke does contract manufacturing, they are still able to scale the brand. But what people don't realize is that how much degree of effort goes into setting up those contract manufacturing processes and then protecting them by non-disclosures and legal contracts and things like that. So it's not that contract manufacturing evolved those processes. Those processes were evolved by the company and then passed on to contract manufacturers. So the uniqueness has to come in the supply chain, in the product. Otherwise, let's say 5 brands selling the same product manufactured by the same contract manufacturer, none of them are going to scale very large.
Interesting. Aanan, you've raised a bunch of rounds of capital, right? You have some amazing people who participated in the round, some very key and strategic investors as well, right? Would love to hear your experience on that front, right? While of course D2C was massively celebrated, right, as 2020 happened, right, and that was largely because the consumer ecosystem converged online, right. We anticipated this to be a 2030 phenomenon, right, something that we saw in 2020, 10 years before. But beyond that, D2C is also when the Mensas of the world and the Global Bees of the world, right, who've just who's such large players. That in a way they've with the way they operate, right, what has happened is for the newer bees, money and supply of money has become a little bit of a challenge, right, and that's largely because cost of acquisition is kind of run through the roof. There are many people chasing the same all of that, right, and a digital first ecosystem, it's everybody is like equal, right. You've gone on to raise a couple of rounds of funding, right? Tell us a little more about that, right? How easy or difficult was that in an environment that we've been seeing, right? Plus, of course, global pressure as well, right? That's been a matter of concern. How has that journey been?
So I think when we started in 2018, we started as a company who built its own products, and we were very deeply entrenched into the supply chain and manufacturing bit of it as well, right?
Sure.
And when we used to pitch back in 2018 to investors, I would say D2C was fairly new at that point of time.
Right.
Although there were brands selling on Amazon, but it seems like 4 years ago, but it was fairly new, and investors didn't understand the concept of how will you sell on Amazon, why will people buy, and things like that, and how do you get the data and stuff like that. So I think at that point, raising the seed round was slightly difficult because they didn't feel that we have the offline distribution expertise, or we didn't come from personally, the three founders didn't come from an HUL kind of a pedigree and all that stuff. So there were certain kind of challenges, right? And on top of that, one of the guiding visions of our company is that whatever we do has to impact human wellness in a certain way, right? And in the early stages, that might not have been a big thing. It didn't mean a lot to a lot. Maybe now it does a lot, but back then it didn't, right? And over the course of, let's say, last 2-3 years, when we have pivoted to this model, we have had to prove a lot of things, that we are able to accelerate brands, we are able to acquire them, we are able to scale them. So a lot of effort has gone into putting metrics behind what our vision was, and the way, so we are in the process of raising our Series A. It's not been an easy journey, but yeah, I think most of the concerns are legit. I won't say there is conservatism, obviously, but there's also a certain degree of understanding that is coming into brand building, with all investors. So people are now trying to understand that building consumer brands and building tech products cannot be, the same principles cannot apply. So for example, a child takes 9 months to be born, right? A brand cannot be scaled in 2 months. You can't just pour capital on anything and scale it. So it takes time. The fine-tuning process takes time. So I won't say the journey has been easy, but I think it has made us focus a lot more on bottom line metrics. So our aim with this entire model is to bring profitability by July next year, and just pour all the money into scaling the brands and acquiring brands with our Series A. Yeah.
Very interesting. And a fun question, right? And not necessarily a fun question, but a question which is very important, right? Now, when you look at tech businesses, right, they get a certain valuation, right? When you're looking at D2C businesses, you don't necessarily get those exciting multiples, right? Investors continue to have their doubts, right, in terms of scalability, adoption, so on and so forth, right? What's your sense of that? How is that frustrating at some point? Because when you're kind of building it, right? I mean, you can see those tendencies, you can see that homogeneity, which is kind of coming in, right? A lot of other factors are moving in your favor, right? Eventually, any economy has to be a product economy, right? I mean, you cannot eat tech, right? Let's be honest about it, right? Is that how do you feel when you don't necessarily see the valuations, or you've managed to get your way through, right? And you've been able to convince your investors, and you've gotten those exciting valuations in the process. What's been your experience on that front?
So I won't say you're totally right. Like the way consumer brands are valued and the way tech companies are valued, I think it's largely a risk-reward equation. So what investors understand, or the way they like to think about this, is that even if this consumer brand is successful, it will plateau at a certain scale, which is not a wrong way to think, because that is just the organic way how things work, right? So a tech product may be able to break beyond that barrier and become very, very large. So they are betting on that risk, and they are able to provide that valuation, because they're willing to take that risk. They are if we have 1000x return, so that's why they give this valuation. So in terms of, I won't say that we have been able to crack the valuation problem. All consumer brands will be valued similarly. Although being an aggregator player now and systematically proving for 4 brands that we have been able to build repeat rates and all that stuff, we may be able to command a valuation which is slightly higher than a typical consumer brand, right? But it is still within that broad ambit. But what is frustrating is typically the expectation of resources, right? So even so within your company, even so for example, we do a revenue of around GMV of around 4.5 to 5 CR per month, and that for a SaaS company or a tech company is going to be a very, very large revenue, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But But when people will hear our valuation, our employees will hear our valuation, they will feel that we are not good as those players who don't know that much about their business or how to scale products, right? So even after having this skill, this expertise, and having scaled the company to such revenue, you still get benchmarked in terms of expertise by the valuations that VCs are providing. So I think that is frustrating at a certain level, but I think it's all part of the game, so you have to live with it.
I think I can imagine that issue, Aanan, but I think we are stepping into very different times, right? The world is graduating to being a product, and when I say that, and that's outside of the tech ecosystem, I think that's around this entire possibility of institutionalization of a lot of these products that we continue to consume, right? And as the world becomes homogeneous, as the world becomes more aware, I think these brands will continue to see an improved, right? And like I said, you cannot eat tech. It's as simple as that, right? Product economy will take over, in a matter of time, right? The last 2 years have paved the way for that, right? And any last thoughts, right? I mean, this has been an absolutely spectacular conversation, right? You've seen in a pre and a post-COVID era, right? Any advice that you have for fellow entrepreneurs or suggestions? I'd love to share this within this conversation before we end the session.
Right. So I think entrepreneurs will get to listen to a lot of advice about how to build company, how to scale, and all that stuff. And one of the things that we'll hear that culture eats strategy for breakfast and stuff like that. So I think all those things really start mattering when you reach a certain scale, right? And if you don't have strong foundations from the very beginning, because it's very easy to ignore those fundamentals in the beginning, right? So for us, there are two fundamentals. One is when you're building a brand, build for repeat rate. When you're building a company, build for culture, right? So those are the foundational principles with which we approach the company, and that requires patience, and that requires you to manage your emotions when you read articles on your story that this guy got this much funding at this valuation and all that stuff. So I think a lot of people are driven by what's happening in the media and how other startups are portrayed. So their aspirations or their plans get derailed by those kind of information. So I think fundamentals. So for us, maximizing human wellness is something that the three founders are really, really excited by. And what we know is that, let's say, if we IPO this company in the next 5 to 8 years, our next startup would be more biotechnologically intensive firm that works on human lifespan extension and all this stuff. So we know that we are in this space for the next, maybe 100 years, or if we are able to live up to 200 years, we will be working in this space. So once you find that level of satisfaction in what you're doing, you can have that patience to build it with the right foundational principles. So this is what my advice is.
Super. Be patient, continue to focus, right? Aanan, this has been an absolutely spectacular conversation, like I said, right? Thank you so much for doing this. What I particularly like about how you kind of, for example, building Wellversed is that you're combining best of both the worlds, right? And I think in a way you're kind of creating and giving an environment to many of these brands which are not necessarily finding their feet in the market, right? They're possibly great founders, they're possibly great products at play, but I think eventually your ability to communicate to the customer in the right way, identify the right customer, I think starting with that, right? To being able to communicate with that customer, and eventually getting it delivered right, I think is just so much more complicated, right? And I think what you've given them is a foundation to play on, right? By systematically breaking down some of these bits and pieces, right? And eventually sort of bringing in the required capital as well as they grow and scale, right? I think such ecosystems become very, very important in an environment which is now being cornered by just about few, right? My excitement with D2C was that this is a space which could have 100,000 to 100,000 entrepreneurs, right? It could have a version of their product, right? And the possibility that they could consume with the consumer directly was just so much more powerful and meaningful, right? I think your job becomes critical in an environment like that, right? And we wish you all the very best, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks a lot, Ashu. Thanks for having me.